Kodak has been working hard for the past 8 years redesigning the structure of their Vision3 line of films. They managed to remove the Remjet layer and replace it with an Anti Halation Undercoat, hence the designation AHU on the new version. The films have quietly been distributed to production companies and we already have features shot on the redesigned film stocks. Near the end of August, Kodak officially announced the new films, and you can head to their website to read the full report. There is an interesting FAQ they made answering a lot of questions, to which I will add a link down below. A few weeks ago, I received an email from 35mm Dealer, a respooling company from Germany who kindly offered me to test the new films. Of course, I jumped at this opportunity to try them and see how they perform compared to the old versions. Fabio was kind enough to send me several rolls, so a big thank you to him for making this happen. Before we look at the films, I want to stress a few things that I was interested in comparing for this first test. If you're here just for the results though, feel free to use the chapter markers below to skip ahead to the images. To begin with, I will be shooting both new and old versions side by side in order to get a feel of how the new structure responds. So we're going to be looking at colors and overall look. Second thing I'm gonna be looking at is how it handles bright lights and halations. Some people seem to be confused by the fact that Kodak removed the Remjet which was responsible for handling halation, and think that the new version will behave like cinestills. That's unlikely as I understand it, since Kodak replaced the Remjet layer with an undercoat layer that should behave equally at handling halation. But in any case, some night shooting and some tests with bright lights should clear this up, and at the same time we'll get to see if the new layer performs equally good or better. Another thing that popped up in the community is an interest about sensitivity. Cinestill notoriously claims that without the Remjet layer and when processed in C41 the films become more sensitive, hence the reason that 500T is marketed as 800T and 250D as 400D. Kodak on the other hand states that this change does not alter sensitometric performance, meaning that there shouldn't be any difference in usage, at least not when developed in ECN2. Of course, since I have the opportunity, I will shoot the films in different ISOs to see if there is any truth in these claims, and we are going to be looking at any differences in both ECN2 and C41 processing. But enough talking for now, let's jump to the test. I started off with a head-to-head comparison developed in ECN2, using two rolls of 250D, one with the Remjet layer and one with the new undercoat layer. I loaded the films in two Canon cameras and I shot identical images throughout the rolls. I set up a portrait in a controlled environment, lighting the scene with two strobe lights, and I also used a color chart to help us visualize any differences. I kept the same aperture and shutter speed for all the images, and by changing the light intensity, I shot this scene in EI 125, 250 and 400. I continued the roll with a simple still life shoot, again using studio lights, and for the rest of the roll I tried to shoot a bit more casually in some walkarounds and some night scenes. Always shooting in the same settings and trying to match my framing and the shots that I didn't use a tripod. And of course, I tried hard in this test to include some realistic scenarios for you guys. I thought this would be more helpful to you than the studio shots. And now let's head over to Lightroom to have a look at the results. I'm starting off with a pair of 250Ds. Both rolls were developed in ECN2 and were digitized with the equipment and settings that you see now on your screen. Let's start right off with the portrait, as this is probably the best example to visualize any differences. As I said before, I use strobe lights for this scene, so it has the least amount of variables, with the light being constant throughout the shoot. On the left side we have the Remjet version, and on the right we have the new film stock. Keep in mind that you are looking at unedited, flat, negative inversions in order to see any actual differences. The main thing I noticed when inverting the negatives is that the new film has a slight tendency towards green, while the older version looks a bit more magenta when compared to it, though probably more natural if you look at it by itself. Something that was consistent throughout the roll, as you will see later. If we zoom in to look at the grain, I'd say it looks more or less similar. I don't see much of a difference there, but let's have a look at the other exposures now. I metered this scene with my Sekonic L308X and I took the measurements just above the color chart around her chin, and in order to see any differences in the actual speed of the film, I maintained the aperture and shutter speed in all of these images, and by changing the light intensity, I shot one image at EI 125, one at 250 and one at 400. The new film looks more consistent between the three exposures, while the Remjet version is leaning towards magenta in the underexposed frame. Honestly, after seeing these images, I have some mixed feelings about them and I'm not sure I can draw many conclusions yet. I triple checked that every part of my process was correct and even contacted the lab to learn more about their process in order to exclude any possible errors on my end. I even did a manual inversion of the main exposure in Photoshop in order to exclude the possibility of Negative Lab Pro tampering with the image, and you can see that the negatives are not exactly the same. Obviously, it's one small correction away to match the two frames, but that is not the point. Also, in case you wondered, both films were from a fresh batch, and since they were exposed with flashlights, there is one less variable in the mix, and that's the shutter. Even if the shutter is not 100% calibrated in both cameras, it's irrelevant in this example, since the strobes are doing all the work. Without them, the images would be nearly black. Now, from these exposures, the one exposed at EI 250 is to my eyes the most normal looking image of the bunch, and the one I would prefer to work with in post. If I had to lean towards one direction or was afraid of blocking up my shadows, I would shoot it closer to 160 or even 125, as it's usually easier to work in post with a well-exposed negative rather than a thin one. Let's move on to a few more examples. Once again, this is the base exposure, and other than the slight green tint, I don't have anything else to comment on. Here is the same scene shot at +1 and -1. The AHU again looks a bit more consistent between these three images, but let's keep in mind that no matter how quickly I shot these, it was a dynamic scene with the sun dropping quickly, so some variation can be attributed to that. I think overall Kodak has done a fantastic job restructuring their film without the Remjet. They managed to incorporate the Anti Halation layer in the emulsion while adding an anti-static and scratch-resistant base layer that stays on the film after developing. Kodak claims that this gives us a cleaner film to work with when scanning and printing. I will agree that the film dried nice and clean, but I don't think I'm the best person to judge it after shooting a few rolls. The motion picture labs will definitely stress test it in this regard, and we'll have a better idea on how it compares to the old film structure. A few more shots here, always on the same lens and same exposures. This one is a good example to answer the question about the halations. As you can see, there are no red halos on the bright lights, so the new film will perform equally good to the old one. Lastly, the cliché. I couldn't do a review of the new films without adding the most used case scenario, the gas station. I hope this is a decent example for you to get an idea of how the film behaves at night, along with a +1, -1 here. I don't want to keep the video for too long, so I will add more examples on the accompanying blog post. Let's move on to a few samples from our roll of 500T now, developed in C41 at home. I shot this on my M2 with the 35mm color scopar, and I did not use a correction filter. Everything you see is white balanced and edited. I think the film overall looks fantastic, the colors are great, and you have plenty of latitude to work with in post. Here are some unedited examples apart from color balancing. I shot this one along with a +1, -1 for reference. And I also shot this night scene at -2 and -4 along with my base exposure. I also shot a couple more rolls during this past month, so I will roll them now on your screen while I add my closing thoughts on the updated films. Once again, I think Kodak did a fantastic job restructuring the Vision3 lineup, and even though their target audience for this upgrade wasn't still photographers, we ended up benefiting from this as much as the filmmakers. Assuming we can consistently source it from various respoolers despite the ban, then we can have in our disposal a lineup of high-end cinema films at all speeds that are now even easier to process. Whether you prefer developing them in ECN2 or C41, now you can just develop all your color negatives together and not have to worry about the Remjet contaminating your negatives or spools. It wasn't the hardest thing to deal with, but now it's just a lot easier for everyone. As for the direct comparison and the slight shift to green, I'm really curious to see the results of other photographers. Kodak is claiming that both films can be used interchangeably in a production, which implies that they shouldn't look any different. If you have done a direct comparison in ECN2, then I'd be really interested to see your results, so feel free to reach out. Finally, a big thank you to Fabio from 35mm Dealer, who kindly offered to send me the films in order to have a first look. He was actually the first to offer these films in Europe and has all of them available on his website. You will find all the relevant links in the description. I think the Vision 3 lineup offers an incredible value for money. The films are usually being sold at half the price of a Portra 400, and I always consider them to be at least on par, if not better, with the Portra lineup in terms of quality. They give you an immense amount of latitude to work with in post, which I always appreciate when editing my images. As always, you can find all the relevant links in the description box below, and you can visit the blog for a more exhaustive version with more image samples from this video. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts on the new films. Does it make it easier for you to try them now that the Remjet is gone? And for those of you who have done a direct comparison, let me know if your results line up with mine or if I'm missing something. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.